morning. It's a great joy to be with you on. It's a rainy day here, uh, in Milwaukee, um, but it is still a great joy to be with you this morning. I'm Reverend Ellen Rasmussen. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the lead pastor at Brown Deer United Methodist Church. And this Sunday morning reflections time is time for us to pause and look at an issue that we're facing and from a faith perspective or a topic. And what has been heavy on my heart and just compounded by some events of the past week is the topic of grief. And it's not something everyone is willing to talk about. Um, Grief and dying, they're hard topics, but it's something that we all experience, and we all respond differently, and it hits us at different times. Sometimes, like when there's a death and we're grieving, we're so numb. We get on automated pilot, right? And we're just functioning. It's part of the importance in preparing a ritual for funerals is that it gives a structure to a time of grieving. And funerals are for those who are still here, for those who have suffered the loss, a time to process, a time to grieve together, a time to cry together, a time to laugh together, to tell stories. It's an opportunity to process our grief, and more it seems folks are opting out of a funeral at a time of death. Certainly the pandemic hasn't impacted much where things were delayed, but there are also folks who will look at the cost or the expenses involved in preparing for a funeral. But it's a way to help us process our grief. It's for those you loved who no longer have the gift of your presence to gather. And there is a common bond of this love and this grief, this what has been and what will no longer be, this loss. Now, today marks the 21st anniversary of 9/11. And I so remember that day. I was it was before I started working for the church. I was in a long-term substitute teacher. And we had first hour. I was in the 6th grade, and I had no idea what was happening. And I walked into the teacher's workroom, second hour, and teachers were in there, and I said, "Good morning." And one turned to me in so much pain and anger and fear and said, "What's good about it? Don't you know we're at war?" And I was dumbfounded. I had no idea what was going on, but as we turned on the news and I watched the towers fall, there were tears, right? I could not stop them. They were just they were just started. Tears is one way that we show our grief. It's also a way we show our joy, right? And tears are for us to use however we need to use them. They're a gift. They're a stress reliever. They're a response when we're angry. They're our response and ours to use for however we need to, as long as we need to. And we know the impact of 9/11 is far beyond that day, with the decisions that led to additional wars, the loss of life, destruction of property. The impact of all of that is still unfolding and will be felt for generations to come around the world. Last week, our Commonwealth cousins lost the monarch, Queen Elizabeth after a 70-year reign, 96 years old. And not only is her family grieving, it's the loss of mom and grandmother and great-grandmother. It's a Commonwealth of Nations that she's been there for 70 years. Rock, stability. But there's also a history of colonization, not only with our cousins, but with ourselves. And there's grief at injustice, that some of that was never processed, some of that was never addressed. There was never accountability from some perspectives. And while there is much outpouring of grief and support, there is also anger at the injustices that were never resolved. And then there's some people who just don't care. Like, what difference does it make? And that's their way. I mean, it doesn't matter. And wherever we are in our response to death, in our grief, as long as our responses are not inflicting harm upon another, right? We can't go and beat somebody up. We can't cause harm to property. How we respond to grief is our process. And grief takes as long as it needs to take. And we know grief is real, and grief is part of who we are, as well as joy. In John 11:35, the verses, depending on the translation, sometimes it's Jesus began to weep, sometimes it's Jesus wept. And Jesus wept at the death of a friend. And throughout the Gospels, when Jesus talks about his own death, folks don't want to hear it. They don't want to talk about it. But Jesus invited folks to talk about death. I have a friend whose loved one is dying, and the family doesn't want to talk about the death, doesn't want to make plans. If they make plans for death, then that means they've given up on life. And I don't believe that's the case. I believe planning for death allows us to celebrate life. It takes a burden off when we know that there's a plan. It helps us begin to process the full spectrum of life. It's okay to talk about grief. It's okay to be grieving. I lost my dad in 1995, and I lost my mom in 1996. They were a couple days shy of 13 months apart. One around Easter and one around Mother's Day. And for the most time, my life, I continue to live, and the joys and the challenges and the sorrows and all of that. But there are some days when the grief feels like it's right here. Like there's nothing else that I can see or function. The loss of my parents, just like, whoa. And I have learned that I just need to face that grief, that I need to acknowledge today is a heavy day, and I need to take care of myself. And that's something I invite all of us to consider when we're hit with grief. To live into the grief, to move into the grief, to embrace the grief, to feel it. We will get through to the other side. God will turn our mourning into dancing, our tears of sorrow into joy. And through it all, God will be with us. God promised in Exodus, I will be with you always. Jesus said, I will be with you until the end of time. And whatever our circumstances, Jesus is there. In fact, in whatever our circumstances, we're called to rejoice. And some days we can't rejoice. It's really hard to rejoice. But wherever we are, the Lord is near, and we need not to be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition to present our requests to God, and then the peace of God that guards our hearts and minds and will protect us in Jesus. Right? It may not make any sense to anybody else, but we are given the emotions to help process all the events of our life. And grief is one of those. And when there is nationwide grief or community-wide grief, and there are many, many people feeling grief. I mean, look at the grief of our combined grief in the loss of the pandemic. I invite you to breathe, to take a deep breath, and remember that God gave you that gift of breath. The ruach of life is within you, and it's within each and every one. And we don't know if the other person's grieving or how they're grieving or what's being put forth. But we need to help each other learn how to grieve. We need to make space for grief, just as we make space for joy. We will tell our stories, and initially in the loss, there will be a lot of tears, or there can be, right? And there can be a lot of numbness. But when we tell our stories, we help process what we're feeling, and we do transform into a new life with scars of the loved ones we loved, right? They're no longer with us, but we carry them in our bodies, in our stories, in our life. And so as we gather this day and we reflect upon the past couple of years and the loss of over 1 million lives in the US to the pandemic, we reflect upon all the losses since 9/11. We give our Commonwealth cousins and all those impacted by the death of Queen Elizabeth the space to grieve. Grief is real. Grief is a part of all of us, but it doesn't define us. It is not all that there is to us. So let's be gracious with each other, and let's be kind. If we're not sure what's going on with the other, then let's respond with grace and love. And deep breathe, being reminded of the sacredness within your soul and the sacredness in the soul of the one in front of you. And let kindness and love reign. Thank you for being with me this morning. It's a great joy to gather with you. I appreciate your gift of presence and your support. And if you'd like to give online, here is information on how to do that. And I'll see you next week.